going to. You lick it? Yeah. Just unwrap it. Pretty good. Good stuff. He's actually You turn it play. Yes. Does it record? Yeah. Yeah, record. It's got a light on the button. It's just light up when it's recording. Hey, you going to class? Harrison, you gonna go to class?
You need this teacher first.
Oh, yeah. That's important. Okay. It's time to get started. If this is too loud, we can turn it down. So, is it too loud? Hey, Dennis, can you turn this down? I think it's number 2. What is it? Yeah, test, test, test. Too loud, too quiet. Is that better? Worse? It echoes? Yeah. Well, that way you'll hear it twice, you know? Oh, yeah. Yeah, why? Oh, I didn't know what you're talking about. I heard you pointing at Scarlett. I was like, I'm sorry, I'll come over here and talk to you all. How are y'all doing? Okay, I think they're good with that. Yeah. I don't think we got the sound system for me.
No. Some people really do need it though.
I learned to whisper in a sawmill, quite literally. So, all right, let's start. We're in chapter 10, and let's just dive into the text. I think that's the best way to continue on, because that's, Paul didn't stop at chapter 9. It continues right on into what he was talking about there in verse 24 through 27, and talking about running of this race. So could somebody read verses 1 to 13?
For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. As with most of them, God was not pleased, for their dead bodies were spread out in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave the evil things as they indeed crave them. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Nor are we to commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor are we to put the Lord to the test, as some of them did and were killed by the snakes. Nor grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let the one who thinks he stands watch out that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except some good common to mankind, and God is faithful, so he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it.
Okay, so Paul now uses this wilderness illustration, and he goes back to the Israelites, right? This was dealing with several years, because I think he's going to use different examples here, and we'll look at that in a second. But just looking at the first couple verses, the word all is emphasized here, right? They all. Think about the people being together. What were they all under? They were all under the cloud. You remember what that's talking about, being guided by God? You remember he went before them in the cloud to show them where he wanted them to go, right? While they were wandering in the wilderness. And at night, it'd be a pillar of fire. If they traveled at night, it'd be the pillar of fire that would light their way. Daytime, just the cloud. But they were all under that cloud. That cloud was their guide. Exodus 13. I think I have here you go. Here's a better illustration for you. We'll go back to that chart in a second. They all passed through the Red Sea. They all received their salvation, their freedom from Egypt. All of them did, right? That idea of passing from bondage to freedom. And, a connection there can be made to us, right? Already. We are guided. We are under the cloud, so to speak, today by God's direction, right? He's guiding us along the way. We pass from our bondage of sin as Christians, and we've come into freedom by God's grace and God's mercy, and received our freedom from bondage. You think about Romans chapter 6, being slaves to sin, and then being now in this bondage to righteousness, right? All were baptized into Moses. Now, were the Israelites baptized? No baptism, right? No baptism in the Old Testament. No teaching of baptism. That's something that was taught by John the Baptist, right? That's the first really time that we see that. But Paul says they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. I want you to think about what he's talking about metaphorically. What's a cloud filled with? Water, moisture, right? And it would be over top of them. So they're underneath the water of God's guidance, of God's salvation, bringing them out of Egypt. And then they cross through the water. Where'd they do that? Now, they didn't touch the water, right? They never come in contact with the water of the cloud.
That's not really what he said. He's just saying, there was water involved in their freedom from slavery. And so they crossed through the Red Sea, water's up on both sides, right? They passed through the water, so to speak. A type of baptism, if you will, something to help us think about baptism. And then he says they all ate the same spiritual food. What food was that? Manna, right? Sent from heaven, right? And if they went out there and collected that manna, it was always out there the next day, right? And they were able to eat that. It was a sustainable food source from God. And then they all drank the same spiritual drink. What did they drink? Water from the rock, right? And so really, if you look at Exodus 17:6, when they entered the wilderness, Moses struck the rock. When they left the wilderness, where did they get their water from as they're leaving? The rock. Again, there's two examples of that. There's two stories about them getting water from the rock. When they enter the wilderness and when they exit. And that exit is in Numbers chapter 20. So what does all this mean? What he's saying is, and with that spiritual drink, what was that spiritual drink in verse 4? Or what was that rock? Yeah, he says that rock was Christ. Behind the scenes, they did not know it, but Christ was there. The New Testament helped us understand that. John talks about at the beginning of time, right? The Word was with God. Jesus was with God. Later, the Hebrew writer and others will write and talk about how that Jesus was involved in creating the world itself. And all behind the scenes, we didn't know it. Now, what he's trying to say is, in all of these things, the Israelites, all experienced their salvation. They all went through salvation. They had their metaphorical baptism. They had their metaphorical food and water from God. They received their salvation from God. But what was the result in verse 5? He says, with most of them, God was not well pleased. So here's a people that obtained their salvation. Are they good to go? No. What happened? When he says, with most of them, God was not well pleased, that is an understatement. Out of 603,548, that was all. And there was how many that God was pleased with? I heard somebody say it. 2, Joshua and Caleb. Paul's saying that as being sarcastic. With most of them, God was not well pleased. To put that on a pie chart for you, this is a pie chart, you just don't know it. That little line there represents the 2. It wasn't wide enough to make it sense here. That's 99.99999%. God was not well pleased with those who had been saved. Paul's trying to make a point here. You've been baptized. Great. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. That doesn't mean you can't lose that salvation. That doesn't mean you won't be pleasing to God. You are puffed up in this. And he's using this as an example on the heels of just talking about running the race back in chapter 9. Be careful, right? Run in such a way, not aimlessly, like just, striking the air, but you bring your body into submission so that you discipline yourself so that you don't lose. You will not be disqualified. And Paul uses the ultimate example of himself. He says, I do all these things so I won't be disqualified. Just because we have obtained salvation from God and are under his grace and mercy does not mean that we can act and behave in however we want. And that's what he's going to talk about next, in what happened to them. In verse 6, I want you to think about that, how that they died. Because this is a real example for us. And he brings out some things about the way in which they behaved. He's saying, don't crave what they craved. And they craved idolatry. That's a real big focus for chapters 8, 9, and 10. That's one of where Paul is going with all this, in this meat sacrifice to idols. You think about the golden calf in Exodus 32. They all ate a meal there in honor of this golden calf, this idol feast, right? And he's explained to them, when Christians share in an idol feast, it was the same as the Israelites partaking in the idol feast of the golden calf. He brings their minds back to the immorality that happened with Balak. Balak goes into the camp of the Israelites and persuades them into worshiping idols again, and he uses prostitutes to do that. Oftentimes, idolatry and sexual immorality were hand in hand. They were intertwined. That's how you were able to lead the Israelites off into the idolatry. You bring them along with this sexual immorality temptation. We provide the women. And the same thing is going on in Corinth at the temple Aphrodite. And so, Balak, he sends the Moabite women to the Israelite camp to seduce them, and then God strikes them down that day. 3,000 people. I'm sorry, what did he say? 23,000 people died in verse 8. You imagine that, going out and seeing bodies scattered. All saved people. All people who had experienced their salvation, had been baptized, had been drinking from the rock that was Christ. Pretty powerful imagery here. These are people that thought they were okay. And then he says in verse 9, let us not test Christ as some of them did, right? A similar argument may have been made by the Corinthians that Paul makes in Romans 6. We can go to the idol temple because Jesus' grace is sufficient for us. I've got the full armor of God. If they didn't have the Ephesian letter yet, Paul would write it after this. But, you think about, I'm protected, right? I'll go over there and I can dabble in sin because Jesus loves me and his grace is sufficient for me, are things that they would have thought of. But he says, don't provoke the Lord to jealousy. I think about Jesus when he was tempted by Satan. You remember Satan takes him up on the pinnacle and he says, cast yourself off because it is written that the Lord will send down his angels and he will protect you. Satan was right. The Lord would have done that. The Lord would have protected Jesus. But Jesus says, you shall not put your Lord to the test in doing that. When we willfully sin like that, and in our minds we think, oh, well, God's grace will just cover this later. We are putting God to the test, just like Satan was trying to get Jesus to do. And so that's some of the things that I think he's talking about in this. And then later, he talks about in verse 10, how that they grumbled. You remember how the Israelites grumbled all the time? They grumbled to go back a lot of times to that old slavery because the way in the wilderness was difficult. And at times they couldn't see why God was having them do this. And they grumbled and they longed to go back to it. Maybe that might be some of the case for these Corinthians. A lot of them were Greek, Gentile. Maybe they had grew up going to the idol temple to eat the idol meals. Maybe their families were still attending meals there. And it was very difficult for them to stop doing that as a Christian. And so, he's saying, be careful in doing this because all these people were saved and then look what they do. And he picks out various situations from the historical account of them falling in the wilderness. that paralleled the Corinthians' behavior in the idol temple. And so he comes up in verse 12 and he says, so whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. You think you're the stronger. Be careful in that. Take this warning seriously is what he's saying. And the temptation and the way out go hand in hand, though. In verse 13, he says, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to man. God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to bear it. Your temptations are not unique. No temptation is beyond your ability and your ability to overcome it. God's going to provide that way out. And all three of these things, it gives us the responsibility and the hope. The responsibility is you're in sin. That's your fault, not God's, not someone else's. It's your fault. Take that responsibility. And in that, he provides the hope, because there is a pathway for you to not do those things and to make right decisions. If I don't overcome, it's not because I could not, it's because I chose not to. And so when we take away people's responsibility and we make sin a sickness, because we do that a lot of times. We say, oh, well, they just not had, they've been tried too hard in their life. They had, the odds were stacked against them. And then we start to make sin an emotional condition, that's beyond spiritual help from God. When we do that, we take away their hope. Because then we say, you know what? They're just going to remain in that sinful state and there's no hope for them. We take away their hope. We are never forced to sin. And so what I think Paul is doing here is getting them ready for what he's about to say about the idol meat. And then the debate will be over in 14 through 22. Comments, questions that you all have about those things?
What you just said, causing them to lose hope or whatever. It also is denying God. I mean, when you say that someone is too far for, cause them to feel like they're too far from God, that can't be. That's a denial of God's power.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Good comment. All right, let's read 14 through 22.
Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourself, I say, the cup of blessing which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Christ. The bread which we break is not the communion of the blood of Christ. For we, through one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh are not those who eat of the sacrifices, partakers of the altar. What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything. Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?
Okay, so he says idolatry is dangerous. Flee from it, right? Don't dabble in it. Get away from it. It seems innocent to you, but it is. It's a dangerous thing. Paul's assuming in verse 15 he's speaking to wise people, right? They thought themselves as intelligent, well understanding of the scriptures. Paul says, if you're so intelligent, what do you think about this? And he asks 7 questions here. And all these help answer, if you go to the idol temple and you share the feast, does that fit within the definition of idolatry? Is eating idol meat idolatry? And so he compares the idol worship feast and the Lord's Supper. This is so beautiful how Paul does this, because he's using this feast imagery here. You think about it, the cup of blessing which we bless. When we bless, we're asking thanks for it. That's what we're doing with the blessing. You think about that cup of blessing. When we partake of the cup on the first day of the week, don't we share in the blood of Christ? We share in it in one sense because we're Christians. I've been saved by the blood of Christ. You've been saved by the blood of Christ. You have. We all have, right? In this room today, right now. And when we partake of that cup, in a symbolic sense, we're also sharing in that blood, in our communion with each other and our communion with the Lord, right? Then he says the bread that we break. You know, the Lord's Supper bread that we share. Don't we share in the body of Christ? It was Jesus' body that was the sacrifice for us. But not only that, think about Jesus being the body of the church as well. He's the head, right? We all share in the body of Christ because we're all members together, one another, of a body. And that body is the Lord. It is Christ. It's Jesus. And so we share in that. And so when you eat of the Lord's Supper, are we all not united and one in what we're doing? And, you know, you think about the union of believers. When we partake of the Lord's Supper, there should be no detached observer partaking. We're together in that. It's not you're partaking of your Lord's Supper and she's partaking of hers and she of hers and his of his. We're together in that. If we want to do it biblically, you think about the priesthood, the group togetherness that they did. Oftentimes, they would give a offering, one of the sacrifice offerings. The giver of the sacrifice and who was on their behalf, they ate of that as well with the priest. They shared in that meal in that. And so he's just saying, this is not just a crazy idea to you all. It's even true in the Jewish faith that when you eat of this meal, you are partaking it as one. You know? And if you're a Gentile or a Greek, you know that when you partake in these pagan meals, you got the same thing in mind there as well, the unity. You sharing in the meal together after the sacrifice. If you share in the meat, you share in the worship. You were there for the worship. You ate of the meat. You were a part of that idol sacrifice, that idol worship. And so Paul clarifies something, though, in verse 19. Because you might think, what are you saying then, Paul? Are these idol gods real? And he's saying, no, I'm not saying that they're real. But you know who is real? Demons. Demons are real. False gods are not real, but demons are real. And demons would like nothing more than for you to partake in an idol sacrifice because they know that will draw you away from God. I don't want you to be a partaker in demons. I want you to be a partaker in God. That's Paul's biggest argument there, I think. And so we don't look at these, when we don't look at these three chapters in context and look at them together, I think we miss a lot of things. You know, Paul's just not talking about idolatry just for the sake of talking about it. He's not just, there's a very methodical approach to this entire letter. And, you know, we read in chapter 8, and sometimes we take away the idea that eating idol meat was only wrong when it makes your brother stumble. No, it's not okay to eat it, even when it doesn't make your brother stumble, because it's idolatry. But if Paul had just began right here, you wouldn't have been given these two important principles that Paul has just taught. Some of the Lord's commands are given to us, and we really don't have a clear understanding of why God wants it that way. There are most of the commands that we follow. We don't know why exactly. But this is one that we do, right? This is an example of the Lord's reasoning behind the command. We get to reflect on not doing something that injures our brother. And we get to reflect on the spiritual impact on ourselves by eating idolatry. Verse 21, let me wrap this up, and then I'll open this up to comments, questions. Verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot share in the Lord's table and the idol, and the table of demons. Now, he's not saying it isn't possible, because that's what they were doing. They were going to the temple. the idol temple, and they were drinking the cup of demons, and they were coming on Sunday mornings and drinking the cup of Christ. But Paul says you cannot do that and get away with a clean conscience. You cannot serve God and mammon, is a teaching from Jesus. And Paul is saying you cannot serve the Lord and demons. Are we going to provoke the Lord to jealousy? Idol worship to Paul was demon worship. Same, hand in hand. You by default, that's what you're doing. And if you're not for the Lord, then you are against him. And if you are for his enemy, you are certainly not for the Lord. You cannot accept the Lord's invitation and accept the invitation of Satan at the same time. Because are we stronger than God? What a powerful statement on the heels of what he's talked about earlier in this chapter. And the 23,000 that fell. They weren't stronger than God. We won't be either. So be careful. Be careful. All right, comments, questions? Nothing?
I think a lot of times we think about idolatry as like being, we kind of talked about this yesterday, in the Bible, well, they, it could be like a statue or something that, was an idol to them. But, think about that in today's terms, what could we, we may not be out there and we may not have a statue in our house, but what is placed that today? We talked about the cell phone,
Yeah.
A lot of times we can, it may be our cell phone that's,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, absolutely.
our trouble.
Yep. Good point.
Church.
What's that?
The Catholic Church. The statues and idols.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Very good point. The sainthoods of everyone, and we're praying through people. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It's a good point.
Anything that takes our focus away from God and is kind of partaking in the sin of the world.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, let's read verse 23 through verse 1 of chapter 11. Bad chapter break. You'll see why when you get there.
All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat in the meat market, ask no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ.
Okay, so in verse 23, it's this statement, again, we saw previously, everything is permissible. I think that's their statement, because then Paul says, but not everything is beneficial. He repeats it. Everything is permissible. Everything is lawful, it might say in your text, their statement. But he says, but not everything builds up. That's a callback to chapter 8, verse 1. You go back to chapter 8, verse 1, remember he's talking about this, if you're not building up, right? If you're not having love, there's no benefit, right? That's what we need to be concerned about. Concern for your brother. in building him up. And so Paul offers two situations to help define the idol meat for us. You have two problems. One is what I call the marketplace problem. What do you do if you go in the marketplace and you buy some meat, and maybe that meat had been used in an idol service? Is that wrong? Paul says, no, eat of the meat. Don't ask any questions about it. Buy the meat. You know, that's what he deals with here, right? Because, you know, the idol meat was not that the meat itself was tainted or something or sinful. The meat was just meat. God recognizes that. But when that meat is in the idol, you know, this unleavened bread, that's just unleavened bread. You can go buy it at the store. You can take it in your house and eat it. You ain't eating the Lord's Supper when you're eating that bread at home, right? You're just eating that bread. Same thing with the idol. In the idol temple, during the idol worship service, that's idol meat. But when that meat is maybe sold secondhand to the butcher as discounted meat, it's not idol meat anymore. Okay? Nobody recognizes it as idol meat, is what Paul is saying. Then the second problem is the table problem. You go over to a friend's house, probably a Gentile non-believer, probably, not necessarily, he doesn't specify, and they're serving you meat. Same thing. Don't ask any questions. Don't cause a big uproar about this. Just eat the meat. Eat the meat and move on. No need for having some idle, angry dispute about this. But what if someone tells you in verse 28, this idol meat, or this meat was used in an idol temple. This is idol meat. What does Paul want you to do then? Abstain from it. Now, you know what's beautiful about this? We don't even know why the person said that. Think about why somebody would say that. We can't say for sure. It could be another guest, and maybe they've been in the kitchen, and by the fruits of their investigation, they have found out that this is idol meat, and they go, oh no, there are Christians here, my friends. I must go tell them. That might be why. It may be that a Christian servant waiting on the table, and you're just out at a restaurant, and you know, what can I get you tonight? Oh, we'll have the meat tonight. And like, oh, all we've got in the freezer is idol meat. Okay, I'll have the chicken, or I'll have whatever. You know, you understand what I'm saying? It could have been that this person was just a host, or maybe it was a non-believer testing the Christians. Hey, I've heard it. Huh?
There's obviously some concern there of the person telling, no matter what reason it is.
Exactly.
They've got concern.
It's the concern of the person that said that,
Yes.
not you. You read Paul's Corinthian letter. You know that meat is fine. You're not in an idol worship. You're over at somebody's house for dinner. You're at the meat market, at the butcher. Paul's saying it's not your conscience, but theirs. He's pretty implicit about that. If you go down and look at, I think it's verse 29, right? Don't eat for the sake of his conscience. I do not mean your own conscience, but the other person's. For why is my freedom judged by another person's conscience? He's saying just because that server thinks that it's wrong, doesn't mean that you do, but you then don't, because you don't want to make them stumble. That's all he's saying. He's not saying you should change your opinion about it. You know, don't change your stance. I think that's the 29 part B, verse 29 in the second part. For why is my freedom judged by another person's? You know, it's not. So don't change your stance on it. You know, if that's how they want to take it, good on them, right? He's saying that's fine. Don't try to correct them. He didn't give any instruction about that. And he says, don't change your stance on it. But because of his conscience, you are concerned, and so you don't eat. How can you give thanks to God for something that harms someone else? You know, if I said, you know what, I don't care, it's idol meat, bring it over here, brother. And then let's all pray. Let's all thank God for this. How can you thank God for that in which you caused your brother to stumble? That's all he means in verse 30. If I partake with thanksgiving, why am I criticized because of something for which I give thanks? And then in verse 32, the principles. Verse 31 and verse 32, the principles of this. Do everything for the glory of God, right? Verse 32, don't hurt someone else, right? Don't harm anyone else. Don't harm those trying to find the Lord, and don't harm or hinder those trying to stay with the Lord. As Christians, sacrificing our rights comes with the territory. That's what Christians are all about. Sacrificing what rights we think we have for the sake of our brother and for the sake of the Lord. And so I think what we've got to do is we've got to evaluate the spiritual significance of what we do. We've got to walk carefully and just be a lot more, in some cases, in my case, be a lot more considerate of what causes my brother to stumble and what pleases the Lord and displeases the Lord. Now, practical applications. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to open this up for comments, questions. It is very difficult to nail down real-world applications for this. Men and brethren and people have tried, and we've got to be very careful in this because this chapter is very, very specific, right? But in a situation you are trying to apply to this is something that is wrong to participate in. That has to be there. It has to be wrong to start with because eating idol meat is wrong, right? True idol meat, not meat sold in the market, not meat served in somebody's house, but meat that is involved in idolatry. And if the situation you're trying to apply to this may cause your brother to stumble, if either of those are present, don't participate. In general, I can't share in participation of doing something that is wrong, even if I say it doesn't really amount to anything. Or, yeah, I'm here and partaking in it, but I'm not really, I know it's wrong. And so I'm mentally not going to partake in it. I think that definitely could be applied to this passage. Some things that I've heard in Bible discussions before to kind of help you think about these things. One is listening to instrumental music. Listening or observing is not answered in this chapter. I think that would be a separate question. So I'd be very careful to apply that to this. Now, I'm not going to take a stance on that this morning, and I don't want to have a discussion on it. If you feel like you need to, you can, but he's not talking about watching an idol worship, but he's talking about actually eating the idol meat. I think there's a lot of wisdom. I'm just saying in that instance, I don't think we could apply this. There are some other scriptures that we could go to. Participating in a wrong worship practice, I do think probably could be applied to this with some parameters. If you go to somewhere that has a wrong worship practice and enter in with them, right? And enter in with them and how and what they are doing and partaking with them. And why would you do that? You might think, well, I don't think this means anything. It's not worship to me. God doesn't recognize this as true worship. But if we join in the activity, participating in it is sinful. And so it's just not what you look like. That's not what Paul is saying here. It's the actual participation in some wrong act. Eating idol meat is at focus here. Observation and geographical location are not in focus here. But I'm real hesitant to apply hardly anything. I'm still trying to work through what I would apply to this. There's not very much that I would, because it is so specific in what Paul is talking about. I think about things that have been presented before, going to a bar, attending a dance, or just being at a place where sin occurs in general. I think we would be more benefited to look at other passages that would have the Christian not go to those places out of concern for temptation of sin. Okay, that's what I'm saying. I think sometimes we come to the scriptures with our own agenda, though, and we read that agenda into the passages. So I think we need to constantly try to see them more clearly for their application. It's hard to not be driven by what we think the applications ought be, but understand the principle and apply the principle. Rick.
So I've never been to a Catholic funeral before. We had an officer who got killed, and so I went. And during that funeral,
Yeah.
Now, it didn't mean nothing to me because,
Right.
you know, no, that is correct. But it's been wrong for me to take that.
Yeah.
And the priest was a little perturbed at me that I put my hand out instead of opening my mouth. But it's just, you know, you're saying it's okay, and you're, you know, some people will just give it to us, just easier to do it, it don't mean nothing.
Yeah.
But you never know who your influence is watching you.
Yeah.
Knows you're a Christian.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's things that we can't do just because it'll make somebody else stumble.
Yeah. Yep. Yep, for sure. This is a real hard passage. And like I said, I just wouldn't use, this is not a passage I would go to in those discussions for those things. I think I'd go to other things, other passages that would be more beneficial, you know, for going to certain places or being in certain settings. All right. One big thing I saw in this book so far, and then we'll end. Do you notice these slogans of the Corinthians that they keep saying? These like $2 phrases. Everything is lawful, you know, and other things. We've mentioned a bunch. Smooth sounding slogans don't determine truth. Be careful in that. I have to be careful as a preacher. Sometimes I come up with some what I think is pretty catchy sayings and witty things to help you remember things in the scriptures. What I come up with, though, you know, doesn't just make that true. That's got to be based on truth. They thought these things that they were saying were in themselves truth. No, Paul said you're wrong. He has a rebuttal for all these slogans so far. So we got to be careful in that, right? In these slogans. Other thing I'll give you, I don't know how familiar you are with Romans chapter 14. Next year, Lord willing, I'd like to go into the book of Romans. It's another one of Paul's hard letters. And, but anyways, I don't think the meat there, or actually, I really don't know how you could make the meat in chapter 14 apply to this chapter. It's not talking about idle meat. It's talking about clean and unclean meat as it pertains to Jewish law. These two texts it's different meat. Okay, so be careful in trying to apply Romans 14 to this text. People have tried to do that before, but Paul doesn't have idle meat focus there. He has clean and unclean according to Jewish law, which is a total different discussion. You know, is it wrong to eat unclean meat for a Christian? No. God appeared to Peter, right? And the sheep came down, right? We have that whole story given to us. So things to think about there. All right. Thank you all for your attention. I won't be with you next Sunday. Dennis will be here. He's down for the lesson and the Bible class. So, all right. Thank you all.
Okay. It wasn't a ring. Got out, decided